What's up guys? So it's been a really long time since I put together a proper how to build a PC tutorial. That's not what this is. However, I am going to make this video in such a way where I cover every single step of the build process from start to finish. So if you did want to follow along with your own build that you're doing at home, you can technically do that. For now, I'm just going to jump right into it. Before we continue, this video is brought to you in part by CDKeyOffer.com. So I have 3 desktop PCs that I regularly bounce between, and all of them are running activated copies of Windows from keys that I got on CDKeyOffer.com. I've used many key sites in the past, but CDKeyOffer is the only one I've never had an issue with. I've never had a bad key, I've never had to call customer service, I've never had to email customer support, and I've never had to activate Windows over a phone, which is super fun. Right now you can get a Windows 10 Pro OEM key for around $22, but wait! Add it to your cart, use the 25% discount code BW20 at checkout, and the price drops to just $16.93. Buy Grabthar's hammer, what a savings. To use your new key, just go to your purchased orders from the drop-down menu to view and copy the key once you get there, and then paste that key into the Windows activation page. Voila! You've got an activated OS that's also eligible for a free upgrade to Windows 11. Alternatively, you can skip the upgrade and buy Windows 11 Pro directly using the same code BW20 to snag the OS for around $23. Activate the key using the aforementioned steps and get the full Windows experience easily and affordably. Thanks again to CDKeyOffer.com. Now back to the main video. This is a high-end gaming PC that I'm actually building for a good friend of mine, for my friend Ian. It's using an AMD motherboard. This is an Asus ROG X670E Crosshair Hero. I always get the names mixed up. It's a Crosshair Hero, but it's using the AM5 socket from AMD. So installing the CPU on this board is going to look a little different than if you're using an Intel motherboard with an Intel socket. But for now, for AM5, for this AM5 CPU, first of all, we're going to open up the socket by pushing down on this retention bar. There's a retention bar here, and on the very end of it, you can just push down gently and swing it out, and then gently let it rise up. It's going to rise up automatically. It's kind of springy. You're going to fold that back, and then you've got the main mounting bracket here. This clamp pulls up just like that. Now we are going to have to remove this protective cover, this plastic cover on here. So I just do that by gently popping it out. And I'm going to be doing some of this with one hand just because the angle's funky, but you feel free to use both hands. You get more control that way. So we have the protective cover removed, and now we can just drop our CPU in. First of all, you want to handle your CPU carefully. It's not super fragile or anything, but you don't really want to take or touch the gold contacts on the bottom, get your nasty finger oils on it and stuff. So I just like to grab my CPU by the edges, and you're going to want to find the golden triangle that's on the corner of one of the corners of the CPU. You can see right here, it's top left. There's the golden triangle top left of the CPU. And you want to find out where the arrow is on the socket as well. Generally speaking, on AM5, it's going to be in the upper left corner. But you're going to want to line those up. You're going to want to line the golden triangle of the CPU with the triangle on the socket. And once you figure that out, how to align it, you'll also see notches, by the way, in the CPU. There's a notch on the top and the bottom of this particular chip, this AMD Ryzen 7 7800X3D, and you're going to want to lower it gently onto the socket so that everything lines up, the arrows, as well as more particularly the notches. And then that's all you do. You don't press it down. Don't press it down. It's zero force insertion. It's already making contact with the golden pins that are on that socket. And by the way, you also want to make sure to not mess with those pins. Those are extremely fragile. Most fragile thing on the motherboard, and bad things can happen if you mess those up. But as long as you're not touching them, you should be okay. All right. At this point, you can lower this mounting bracket like so, just gently, and then you push down the retention bar again, and locking it into place like so. And just like that, CPU installed. So we're going to do the CPU cooler next. This one's a little tricky in terms of, sort of helping you walk through it, because every CPU cooler is different and comes with its own set of instructions for its mounting process. So I highly suggest that you read the manual for your particular cooler and make sure that you're reading the right instructions for the socket you're using. So, most coolers have wide compatibility with a number of different sockets. If you're doing AM5, if your motherboard socket is AM5, then you want to look up the instructions in that manual for AM5. The CPU cooler I'm using is the Lian GA2 LCD. This is a 360mm liquid AIO or all-in-one cooler. It's got a big radiator on it and some tubing that connects it to a pump block. and it's basically an all-enclosed liquid cooling unit. One thing I want to point out, regardless of the cooler that you're using, let's talk about thermal paste for a second. Some coolers, a lot of coolers nowadays, come with pre-installed thermal paste, and you can see that on the cold plate, which is the part of the cooler that makes contact with your CPU, there's already a square of thermal paste pre-applied. So that means I don't have to apply my own. It would be redundant and could potentially affect performance, I'm not sure, but you don't need to apply anymore if your cooler already comes with pre-applied thermal paste, and your manual should tell you if it does or not if you can't tell. In the event that you don't have pre-applied thermal paste on your cooler, then you're going to need to apply it yourself. With that, I just suggest any trusted brand of thermal paste. There's just an infinite number of ways, many schools of thought on how to properly apply thermal paste or what's the best method. I've never really had a problem, regardless of the CPU that I use, by doing a straight line, roughly that thick, a straight line up and down the center of the CPU. Some people like to do an X, and sometimes I do an X as well. But as long as you're using enough thermal paste, but not too much, you should be good to go. So that looks pretty good. I'd say that's a pretty healthy amount. Anything more than that would probably be a little excessive. And don't worry about applying too much. Worry about applying too little. Don't do like the grain of rice method. CPUs have gotten a little bigger, and the elements inside are kind of more spread out. So the grain of rice method might have worked back in the day, but I prefer a nice line or a nice big X across the entire IHS, which is the silvery part of the CPU. I'm just going to wipe this thermal grease off really quick because we don't need it, again, since my cooler comes with it already pre-applied. All right, so now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and read the manual for my cooler here, and then we'll carry on. All right, the AIO liquid cooler is now installed, or rather it's partially installed. We have the pump block mounted to the CPU and the motherboard that we just did, but we still have the radiator and fans that need to mount to the case, but we're not quite ready for that, so we're gonna leave it hanging out for now. One thing I wanted to note about this installation is if you're using a liquid cooler like similar to this one, you'll probably have a few cables, one or more cables coming off of the pump block. One of them is probably for your pump. So again, consult your manual, but it's most likely going to go to the PWM pump header on your motherboard, like that, and you can leave that and you can plug that in right away. But other cables, like this one that goes to the USB 2.0 header on your motherboard, this one I'm actually going to leave for later. I'm going to actually uninstall this cable. The reason being is that the USB 2.0 header that cable needs to plug into is at the very bottom of the motherboard. And you could just plug it in now, but it's going to look really nasty with that cable just hanging out. It's just a total eyesore. So what we're going to do is we're going to unplug this for now and wait until we install the motherboard into the case. That way we can route this cable behind the motherboard, along the motherboard tray, to make things look a lot tidier. One more note that I just realized I should probably mention about the AIO is that mine came with the fans pre-installed to the radiator, which is very nice of Lee and Lee to do that. But a lot of AIOs, I would say most of them, don't do that. You have to install the fans to the rad yourself. And if that's the case, you want to make sure that you're mounting the fans and orienting them the proper way. So generally speaking, you want the fans to be pushing air through the radiator fins, the fin array on the radiator, as opposed to pulling air through them. That's going to be a bit more effective, and it's also probably going to look a little bit nicer with the blades facing outward. Additionally, you can see that these are some fancy fans, no pun intended. They actually have gold connectors, gold contacts in between them so that they can be daisy chained together, resulting in the need to only have one cable on the end. For all three fans, powering all three fans. And this cable is on the side of the fan, but for the fans that you might be using, you want to make sure that you don't have the cable facing outward, because it's just an eyesore, unless you truly don't care. But typically speaking, you want to have whichever side the cable is facing, face towards the inside of your case, so that when it's mounted, you're not seeing that excess cabling. It's just a much cleaner look overall. And the best way to approach that is before you mount your fans to your radiator, you want to decide which way you're going to mount the radiator to your case. Are you going to mount it with the tubes facing to the front of at the front of the case, or at the back of the case? Or if you're mounting the radiator to the front of the case, are the tubes going to be at the very top? You probably don't want them mounted at the bottom, because then you can run into some issues with the pump and stuff. But you want to decide which way you're orienting your radiator in your case. That way you know which way to mount your fans. This will make a lot more sense and be much easier to visualize once you're ready to install the radiator into the case, but we have a few more steps before that. Installing memory, this is a really straightforward process, and it's going to work a couple different ways depending on how many sticks that you have. So most motherboards, ATX motherboards like the one we're dealing with here, have 4 DIMM slots. These are the slots that we're going to be slotting our memory into. If you have 4 DIMM sticks, or memory sticks rather, then you can just simply populate all 4 of those slots. But if let's say you only have 2 sticks, which is a very popular configuration, you only have 2 sticks, which slots do you put them into? It does matter, because in order to take advantage of the memory kit's dual channel capabilities, which is better for performance, you're going to want to put them in the slots that are wired for dual channel. Generally speaking, most motherboards, that'll be slots 2 and 4. So if we're starting from the left, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4. Slots 2 and 4 are generally the ones that you want to populate if you're only dealing with 2 sticks. But I would highly suggest consulting your motherboard manual just to be sure. Once you figure that out, you're going to want to prep the DIMM slots for memory installation. And the way you do that is you have these plastic tabs on either one or both sides of your DIMM slots. In this particular motherboard, it's going to vary from board to board. For this board, those tabs are only on the top side. So what you want to do is you want to push those tabs down gently on slots 2 and 4. Those are the ones we want until they kind of go down like so. That's going to open them up. And then you want to also make sure that you're lining up your memory sticks properly, because they are keyed. You'll notice that at the bottom of your memory PCB, the memory sticks PCB, there's a notch, a little cutout there. That it looks centered at first, especially on DDR5 memory, but it is not. It has to go in a certain way, and it has to line up with the notches on the slots, which you can see there. They have little silver metal pieces on them. So let's see, does this look right? This looks right. Yeah, the slots are matched up, they're lined. And then, so you gently just push the stick down evenly, and then once you feel some resistance and it won't really go any further, that's when you need to really apply some firm pressure. So I usually just kind of grip it with both hands with my thumbs on the top, and I push down firmly with even pressure until I hear the snap. Oftentimes it'll be 2 snaps, one for each side, because the sticks don't always go down exactly at the same time on each side. So let's try that again, so you can sort of get a feel for it. I'm going to press down. That was one side, and that was the second side. The second side was the top side, and you could hear it. It was a bit more clicky. That was that plastic tab snapping back into place, and it should be completely up right where in the same position that it was before. If it looks a little off from the other tabs that are currently up, then you want to try it again. You can try just pushing it down, pushing that tab down, taking the DIMM out, and then trying it again. You want to make sure that it's properly seated, and don't be afraid about pushing it down too firmly. These memory sticks are pretty resilient. Just make sure that you have the notch lined up, otherwise that's not great to put that kind of pressure on the stick. But let's try it again for our second module. Get it down into position, and then firmly down, even pressure, and there were both clicks. I could hear both clicks. It's a very satisfying snap/click, so it's pretty easy to tell, and you can also visually check it again by looking at the tabs. So there it is, memory installed. I'll be installing 3 NVMe M.2 drives today. We've got the crucial P5 Plus up top, which is going to be our boot drive, and then I've got 2 of Corsair's MP700 Pros. These are Gen 5 drives, super fast. Ian needs a lot of storage for his build. These are 4 terabytes each. The P5 Plus is 1 terabyte. So in order to do this, I should also mention that the MP700 Pros they came with a pre-installed heatsink/cooler. It's got a little fan, so it's got an active cooling system on it. You could use that if your SSD comes with something like that. You could use it. I installed mine because this motherboard already comes with pretty decent M.2 heatsinks built in. And the first thing we're going to do here is actually remove those heatsinks. So there's one up top here. It's a big fatty. And you also want to consult your motherboard manual to make sure that you're installing your SSDs in the proper slots, because they're not all created equal. They can operate at different speeds, whether it's Gen 3, Gen 5. You don't want to install a super fast Gen 5 drive into a Gen 3 slot. So you want to make sure that you consult the motherboard manual to ensure you're getting maximum performance with your hardware. Now you want to make sure that you install the M.2 drive the proper way and in the right orientation. So you want to look for the gold contacts. You can see them right there on one side, and it is keyed. You can see that there's a notch on one side of it. So you want to make sure that that notch lines up with the notch in the connector, and you sort of angle it in like at a 45-degree angle. It's kind of awkward, so you just sort of slide it in gently at a 45-degree angle. Should look something like that. And then you push down gently until it bottoms out. And then usually there's either a screw or a little locking mechanism, in this case, a toolless locking mechanism, which is a nifty feature on some motherboards, in order to securely mount it down to the board. I think this isn't good, because I actually took the thermal pads off of this heatsink. I shouldn't have done that. Yeah, the whole point of the M.2 heatsink is to leverage the thermal pads that often come included in order to dissipate heat from the controller and the memory chips, but I have kind of messed that up. It's okay. This will still work. This will still work just fine. Oh God, okay, I got it on there. It looks extremely ugly, but it should still do the job, so we're just gonna go for it. We can always check temps later. Mount this back on and screw it down. Beautiful. All right, first one installed, and then I believe for this board I have to remove these screws. There's 1, 2, and 3. Oh, I keep forgetting that I've installed SSDs on this board before. There's another one. Look at this. This board, wouldn't it be nice if new motherboards just came with pre-installed SSDs? It'd be fun. And also probably really expensive. But anyway, oh, you also want to make sure that, you know, if you've got some factory thermal paste or thermal pads on these M.2 slots, that you remove the plastic film. That's just for protection and to cover it for dust. You want to remove those. And make sure that you remove them from both sides, from both the thermal pads on the slot itself and as well as underneath the heatsink, if there's any. It's not something you want to miss, otherwise the thermal performance could be greatly affected. All right, actually you get a little slightly better angle on this M.2 slot right here. You can sort of see those gold contacts, and you can see the notch. You can clearly see the notch to one side on the right side there. So again, you want to line that up with the notch on the drive. 45-degree angle, push in slightly till it stops, all the way down, and then either screw it down or use the toolless mechanism. Oh, you know what? I think I accidentally installed this in the wrong slot. I meant to install the P5 Plus into the top slot. I don't think it mattered. I think I checked the motherboard manual. It shouldn't matter, but this just makes more sense to me to have the boot drive up top and the 2 storage drives side by side on the bottom. So yep, I messed that up. My bad. I was so focused on teaching you guys. Totally dropped the ball on that. Okay, let me go ahead and take this off. This thermal pad has really been through the ringer. He's really seen it all. Okay, let's try this again. And our third one. Okay, going down. Perfect. All right, we are finally ready to install our motherboard assembly into the case. This is the Lian Li O11 Dynamic Evo XL. The O11 is one of the most popular cases on the planet right now, and so I guess it's good that we're using such a popular case for this video. But regardless of the type of case that you're using, you're going to want to prep it for motherboard installation. So what that means is taking off the panels where you can. Whichever removable panels exist, I suggest removing. It'll just give you open access, free and clear, to install the motherboard and other components. Every case is going to be slightly different in terms of how those panels are removed, so consult your motherboard, or the case manual rather. Sometimes the panels are toolless, like you see here. Other times you need to unscrew some stuff. These are coming off nice and easy. And also, if there's any dust filters that are covering up, you know, like the the fan mounts or any kind of major area of the case, you want to remove those as well. Next, you want to lay the case down on a stable surface that's protected from scratches and things like that, because this is just a giant chunk of metal. It's going to just put dents and random gashes into whatever desk you're building on if you're not protecting it with something like this Gamers Nexus mod mat that I highly recommend. It's awesome. And then, yeah, you just lay it down like that, have some decent lighting, you know, so you can see what you're doing, and then you're ready for motherboard installation. Now, before we just drop the board in and start screwing it down, there's a couple things to note. The first of which is standoffs. So these are standoffs, these little pegs that are raised. There should be, I think there's what, 9? Usually there's, you know, about 9 of them, 8 or 9 of them if you're using a standard ATX board. And in a lot of cases these days, these are pre-installed. They'll already be here for you. But in the event that they're not, the case should come with them. And you can just, you can follow the instructions to install those in the proper holes. Make sure that you're mounting them in the proper holes. But in most cases, they're just going to be pre-installed already. And the center one, the one in the middle here, is oftentimes raised a little bit. It's a little taller than the other ones, just so that it can latch onto the motherboard. It makes it a bit easier to place the motherboard and get it into position. The other thing to consider is the motherboard I/O shield. So every motherboard has an I/O shield that covers sort of protects the rear I/O here. A lot of motherboards these days have their I/O shields built in, like this one does. But in the event that it doesn't, it'll look something like this. This is a really cheapy one, but you get the idea. And you're gonna wanna mount this in the case first before you put the board down. You wanna make sure it's facing the right way. There'll be one side that clearly pops in better, where it's more, it bites it, bit of a bite. You wanna make sure it's completely flush, and then you should be good to go. But again, ours is pre-installed, so we don't need that. Chances are yours is too. Now, I have a bad habit of just gripping the board by the water block, the pump block, which I don't recommend. I do it all the time and I've never had an issue, but if you want to be extra safe, which, why not? If you can be extra safe, you might as well. I would suggest grabbing the board by its edges, lowering it in slowly, and then lining up. The best thing I do, or my favorite thing to do, is to line up the I/O shield with the square, the cutout on the back of the case, which you can't really see there. But and if you have a raised standoff like the one I mentioned, it'll also just feel like it sets, like it's settled, and that it's kind of in place. You can sort of wiggle it, see it's not moving around. It's a good sign. Now you just got to use the screws that come included with the case. Check your case manual to make sure you're using the right screws. And then you just start screwing them down in the holes. You'll see little mounting holes in your motherboard. And you don't want to you definitely do not want to over tighten these. Don't leave them loose, but don't over tighten them either, because otherwise you could end up stripping the screw or the standoff that's underneath it, and that's not good. So you just want to do it snug. Just do it snug. Maybe wait till there's some resistance and then do half a turn, and that should be plenty. Now, we can mount our radiator. So actually, you know what? I'm gonna teach you guys something. There's a little pro tip. Before we mount our radiator, so here's the thing. I already decided I'm gonna mount my radiator with the tubes facing at the front of the case. I think that this just looks nicer in my opinion. You know, if it will bend in such a way where it works on the other side as well, you could do that, but this looks a little too cramped here. The hoses, the tubes are not, I'm not feeling that aesthetic, so we're gonna go this way. But one thing to point out is that you'll notice, like, in this case it's not very obvious because it's such a huge case, but in cases that are smaller, this radiator, if you're dealing with a radiator, is gonna be a lot closer to the board, right? And if you're much closer to the board, by the time this is installed, you're gonna have a much harder time accessing some of the connectors that are at the very top of the board. For example, like your CPU cable, the CPU cable that comes from your power supply. We have not installed the power supply yet. We're gonna do that in a little bit. But what I like to do is I like to get the CPU cable out early, the 8-pin EPS CPU cable for my power supply. I like to plug that into the motherboard before I install the radiator to the case. It's helped me tremendously in many builds. So I just plug it in, because that EPS connector is usually in the top left corner of the board. I plug it in, and then I shove the rest of the cable through the nearest opening, the nearest cutout or rubber grommet, and we'll access that from the back side of the case later on. But I just wanted to get that up to speed. There are some other cables that we'll be plugging into the top, like little fan cables and stuff, but those are generally easier to deal with. But it depends. If you're dealing with a really cramped case, you might want to install those early as well. But now that we have the 8-pin cable connected, I'm just going to go ahead and mount the radiator. This is another time for you to consult your case manual, because sometimes these brackets are removable. Like this mounting bracket right here is actually removable. I could uninstall it, which has its benefits at times, but I'm actually totally fine installing it as is without removing it. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. This is of course going to be with the screws and potentially washers that came with your AIO, if you're using an AIO. Here's a look from the other side so you can see what's going on. I like to leave the screws a little bit loose initially until I've got all of them threaded. Otherwise, sometimes one of the holes won't line up, but this keeps it flexible so I can move them around slightly if I need to in order to get them all in there. And just like your motherboard, you don't ever want to over tighten any of the screws in a build. Just make sure they're snug. That should do the trick. Next, we're going to wire up our front panel connectors, which are cables that are attached to your case, generally located behind the motherboard tray. They're typically grouped together like this. And these are wired to the front of your case for all of the I/O. Your case's I/O, your inputs and outputs. That includes things like your button, your power button, reset, and USB ports, audio jack, things like that. So you can see we've got a bunch of them here. And these are going to wire to our motherboard. The best way to go about this is to route each cable through the grommet or cutout that's closest to the header that cable is supposed to plug into. So I can see over here that this is my USB 3.0 header. I've got my USB 3.0 cable, and it looks like this is the closest grommet there to that header. So I'm going to push the cable through and make sure it's lined up properly. And you'll have to consult your motherboard manual if you're having a hard time finding out which ports or headers are where. The location of all of them are in that manual. There you go. It's simple as that. We'll do another one here. Here's our USB Type-C cable. This is for the USB Type-C cable port on the front of the case. And I can see that we've got our USB-C header right here. USB-C is a little tricky. It looks like it's reversible, like it can get plugged in either way, but it is not. It is keyed. So you want to make sure you're plugging it in the right way. If it doesn't go in smoothly the first time, flip it around 180 and try again. Looks like I got lucky on that first attempt. Front panel. This is a very important one. And this is going to control our power button, reset, any hard drive LEDs, power LEDs on the case. So this is the header for this. It's a bunch of little pins generally located towards near the bottom right corner of the motherboard. I can see it right here. Do a little zoom action while we're at it. So you can see there it is, this guy right here. This is also something you'll want to consult your motherboard manual for. Now, Lian Li has done us a solid by providing a front panel assembly where they're all in one housing, but generally speaking, a lot of the time you'll find that these are individually wired. So you'll have to plug in each pin separately, which is it is a pain. After all my years of building, it's still an annoying part of the process, but a very necessary one if you want your power button to work anyway. So that makes it a lot easier. One and done. This is HD audio. This is for the audio jack that's at the front of the case. And this is usually, the header for this is usually located on the bottom left corner of the motherboard. Now, sometimes front panel connectors are not, sometimes you can't plug them in right away. For example, we have a SATA cable here. SATA cable, I think this is for powering the RGB controller. This might be for the case's built-in RGB controller. Every case is different in terms of what features they have. Yours may not have this, but this one does. It's SATA, and we'll need to plug this into a SATA cable that's coming from our power supply, but we haven't installed our power supply yet, so we'll just leave him out of the picture for now. We'll circle back to him later. All right, let's install our case fans now. We already have the 3 radiator fans inside of the case. Now it's time to install the remaining case fans. We have 7 of them in total that we're going to be installing today. This is either going to be a very simple or rather complicated process depending on the fan that you use, the fans that you use. And in its simplest form, you might have fans like this one. This is just a standard Noctua fan with a single PWM cable coming from it. It has no fancy lighting, no RGB or anything like that. It's just the 4-pin PWM cable. In this case, you're just going to connect that to one of the 4-pin PWM headers on your motherboard. These are labeled. If you've got good eyes, you might be able to see that they're labeled channel fan, usually channel fan 1, channel fan 2, channel fan 3, and it's like usually CHA underscore fan. So CHA is channel for short. No worries if you're having a hard time finding them, just check your motherboard manual. It's all listed there. So that's the simple version. What we're dealing with today is a bit more complicated. These are the Lian Li Infinity fans, the SL120s, and these are daisy chainable, as I mentioned, so they snap together like so. I should have mentioned on the other standard fan, you're going to have to most likely install those one by one to your case, but these ones are installed in a different fashion slightly because they can be daisy chained like this, so it becomes sort of one unit, and then you just mount that, place that wherever you want in your case, and then you screw it down. But you can see with this arrangement of fans, we only have 2 cables coming off of the entire 3-fan assembly. One of those cables is the same 4-pin PWM cable connection that we saw on the standard fan. But the other one is RGB. It's a 3-pin, 5-volt addressable RGB cable. And that's going to connect to a number of possibilities. So you could either connect it directly to the motherboard if it has a 3-pin, 5-volt header, or if your fan system or fan assembly or whatever fans you purchased included a controller, its very own controller, whether it's proprietary or universal or whatever, then it's probably best to just connect it to this. This is just a lot more convenient because it's a single hub that you can control and connect multiple panels to. So this one has 4 channels, I believe. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, this isn't really going to pertain to most of you building right now, unless you have this exact fan set. So yeah, there's an example, right? So this is one channel that I've connected to this 4-channel controller. I have room for 3 more channels, and that's perfect because I'm actually going to put the radiator fans as another channel. Then I'm going to have another 3 fans as another daisy chain channel on the side of the case, and then our 4th channel is going to be just a single fan at the rear. So that should give you an idea of how these fans connect to everything else. But we're going to save all that cable management and plugging in stuff for later, because right now we're just focused on installing the fans to the case. Because again, we're going to have to route all this stuff behind the motherboard tray, and we can't really access it right now with this case on its side. And whatever fans you're using should have come included with the appropriate screws to mount those fans properly. So here are our first set of screws, and we're going to mount this first 3-set channel of fans to the bottom of the case. In this case, we have some thumb screws. We have a removable bracket that I think if you remove this thumb screw, aha, it should pop out just like that. And just as I mentioned with the radiator fans, you want to position and mount these the right way. So you want to make sure that you know, the blades are pulling or pushing air in the direction that you want them to. So in this example, we're going to want the fans pulling air from the bottom of the case and pushing it upward into the rest of the chassis. So that looks good. These are reverse blades, so it looks like they might be, at first glance, pushing air downward, but they're actually pulling it upward from the bottom. So that's good. And then also, you bear in mind what side of the fans or fan assembly the cables are coming off of. Do we want the cables to sort of be on the left side of the case towards the back, or do we want them to be on the right side? So based on, you know, whatever cable grommets or cutouts are available to you, the actual cable management features of your case is going to help you determine which side's best. I have a cable grommet on this side, so I'm going to keep the cables over there. And now that I've got this situated, I've got the orientation that I want, I can go ahead and screw this in place. Power supply is next. Before we install this into the case though, we're going to want to connect all of the power supply cables that we need to the unit itself. The reason being is that once the power supply is installed, it's going to be really difficult to access these ports. So we want to do it ahead of time. The cable arrangement is going to look a little different from system to system, but for the most part, there are a few cables that are more or less universal for any build. The first of which being is the 24-pin ATX cable for your motherboard. This big chunky guy, if it'll focus there. 24 pins, it's the biggest connection, the biggest connector by far. It's hard to miss. And you want to know which side of the cable do you plug into the power supply versus the motherboard. So you can see that one is a single connection, single cable, and then this one splits off into two. You want the one that splits off into two connecting to the power supply. Sometimes if you're lucky, it'll even, the manufacturer of the power supply will print PSU on the side of the connection that's supposed to go to the PSU. And if all else fails, just consult the power supply manual. So first cable is installed. The next one that you're almost always going to need is CPU. Oh, duh. The reason why I couldn't find it is because you can't see it's off camera right now, but it's already connected to our motherboard. Remember, this is what we plugged in to the motherboard right before we installed our radiator because it was going to be a lot easier that way. And sure enough, it is. We'll go ahead and connect this though when we're actually ready to install the power supply. PCIe is next, PCI Express. These cables are for your graphics card. So one end, again, will go to the power supply, and this end, in this particular example, you can see splits off into two. Sorry, I'm not exactly centered here. It splits off into two, and then from each of those two connectors, you can either do connect it to a 6-pin plug, or it's got these extra 2 pins that you can push together and then install it for an 8-pin plug, depending on the graphics card that you're using. Some graphics cards will only have one or the other. Some will have both. I haven't seen one of those in a while. It's usually for older generations. And some of them will have multiples. And a lot of high-end graphics cards that are power hungry will actually use 2 or even 3 of these 8-pin connections. So again, check the manual for the appropriate component. I think in this case you want to look up your GPU manual, look up those instructions, or really just see what power connector you have on your GPU. One thing to note is that PCIe isn't the only type of cable that you can use to power your graphics card. A lot of modern GPUs are now using what's called a 12-volt high power cable connection, and that allows for the convenience of using a single cable in order to deliver up to 600 watts of power to your graphics card, assuming that you have an ATX 3.0 certified power supply, which this one is not. Which is why this power supply comes included with this cable. This is actually a 12-volt high power connection right there. But on the other end, we have 2 8-pin connectors that resemble more of what you'd see on a PCIe cable. This is just because we're splitting the power. We don't have a 3.0 power supply that can do 600 watts over a single cable, so instead this one splits it up into 2. And then this would actually connect perfectly to our graphics card because our GPU does use a 12-volt high power connection. However, it's getting a little trickier here. I'm using custom sleeved cables, cable extensions as well, just to make our cables look a little bit nicer. Actually, that's the wrong, this one. So this does have that 12-volt high power cable on one end, but then your traditional traditional PCI Express connectors on the end. So those are female, so we're going to want to actually plug in the standard PCIe cables. This is all labeled on the power supply. So there's 1, there's 2, and we have the 3rd and final PCIe cable. And as you can see, one of those cables branches off into 2 connectors. So we have a total of up to 4 8-pin PCIe plugs. However, we only need 3 of them. Let me free our little cable extension here. We can go ahead and plug these in one at a time. This really just pertains to this particular build. You may not be using cable extensions at all, and in that case you can completely ignore this, but thought I'd include it for those of you who are dealing with a similar setup. You want to make sure that the connections are secure, by the way, and obviously they're keyed. You can tell because they only fit in one way for the most part, but also that there are these tabs. See that plastic tab on one side of the connector? There's no tab on the other side. That's going to line up with the little bump that's on the female connector. You can see that little bump on the top of it? It looks like a little shark fin. So those are going to go together until one overlaps the other. And that should provide a secure connection. You can always tug on it a bit to make sure that it's not going to pop out and that it's actually secure. So I know it looks a little messy, but here we have our 3 PCIe cables coming from the power supply, connected now to our kind of wonky but effective cable extension. In case you were curious, don't worry, we have an extension for the ATX cable as well. Of course we do, because this is it's the biggest cable in the entire build. It's the most obvious. Of course it needs to look pretty. I'll go ahead and snap it into place. Again, aligning the clip with the shark fin. There you go. And this is the end that we'll be connecting directly to the motherboard. Okay, I know this is kind of tedious, but we only have one more cable to go, and that is SATA. This is for things like our RGB or fan controller, fan hubs. Maybe your case might have a SATA plug for something or another. And this one actually has, this one cable has 3 SATA plugs connected to it. We're gonna plug that into where it's labeled SATA. Your power supply, you know, the verbiage might differ. It might say peripheral or something like that. And those are all the cables that we need to plug into our power supply, save for the CPU cable, which we'll plug in just a bit. We're ready to install the unit into the case. Now you want to check your case manual to find out where to install your power supply and how to install it if it's tricky for your particular case. Our power supply is going to go right back here like so, okay? And it looks like this is a removable bracket on the back. We could remove it with a couple screws. So if we wanted to, we could remove this little square bracket and then mount that to the power supply outside of the case before bringing it back in. But I don't really see a need to do that, especially when the power supply already fits so easily like so. The power supply fan is facing outward. You don't want it facing inward in this case because there's no ventilation here. This is just a flat, solid panel that would completely choke the fan, and your power supply wouldn't last very long in that case. So you want to make sure that the power supply fan is always facing the most ventilated side of your case. Oh, and I almost forgot. Jumped the gun there. Our CPU cable should get plugged in first. There we go. Then you want to get the 4 screws that came included with your power supply in order to screw them into the back of the unit and securely into place. Ta-da! Okay, now we got to get the GPU in here, which means we have to remove a number of these expansion slots based on how many expansion slots wide, or tall, however you want to cut it, our graphics card is. So this is our GPU. This is an RTX 4080 Super from Gigabyte. Specifically, this is their 4080 Super Master, the Aorus Master. It is a big card. Everyone take a second to just marvel at the heatsink is out of control, dude. Anyway, I'm really getting carried away, but it is phenomenally huge. Would you believe that this massive GPU is only a 2-slot card? Something like this would normally be 4, maybe a 4.5 slot card, but this one only has 2. And you can tell by looking at the silver bracket on the back, the part that makes the little L shape. You can see that there's 2 notches there. So that's 2 slots, which means we have to remove 2 expansion slots in order to get this to fit. You're going to want the top expansion slot. The first one you do is going to want to line up with the PCI Express slot. So that would be this one right here. Get out your handy dandy screwdriver. Pop out. Well, sometimes you have to undo the second one below it in order for the first one to come loose. It can be stubborn. Now they should probably both pop out. There you go. All right, so our expansion slots are coming out. And then before you actually install the graphics card and put it in, you want to make sure that the plastic tab, there's a plastic tab to the right of the expansion slot, or the PCI Express slot, sorry, that you want to push in a downward position. You want to make sure that it's downward, all the way down, otherwise the graphics card won't go in. So once that's pushed down, then you take your bad boy and slowly line up the gold contacts of the GPU with the slot on the motherboard. Big old slot. You might have to like put your other hand holding the case to make it stable. You need to press it firmly, but then you should hear a nice little snap or click once it goes in. That's the sound of that plastic tab going back into place. And once it's in there, you just screw it down. The same screws that you just removed, which can be tricky sometimes if you're dealing with a GPU with a massive cooler that can get in the way of what you're doing. Oh, while I'm down here, I probably should have done this right before installing the GPU, but I'm going to take the dust stickers off, the protective stickers off of the fans. It's got some stickers on the center of each fan. I'm sure you guys saw that. Now on to cable management, the final frontier of any build, and some would say the most dreadful part. And really there's two ways you can approach this. You could either just cram everything on this side of the PC and then slap it shut with the side panel and hope to God it doesn't break the dam. Or you can spend some time and effort to tidy things up, make it look a little nicer, a bit more organized if you need to ever get back in there to rework stuff, install new components and things like that. It's also going to depend heavily on your case. Do you have a more budget case with not a lot of cable management features or a lot of clearance room behind the motherboard? Or do you have something more generous like this case where you really could just cram everything in there and have no worries that the side panel would shut? Before that, we have a bunch of cables and things that we still need to plug in. Like our 24-pin ATX, the fan controller, and a bunch of other stuff. So what I like to do is I like to start with the thickest cable first, being the 24-pin ATX cable for our motherboard, and I'm going to go ahead and just route that along the cable ties and Velcro straps that are provided here in the case. A lot of cases have these now, but if you have something more entry level, then it might not. But go ahead and use whatever features, cable management features come included with your case. They're extremely helpful. Tie down points, Velcro straps. But when I reach this point in the build, I like to route the fattest cable first and make that the first cable that I sort of lay down against the motherboard tray. And then I start to layer increasingly larger cables, thicker cables on top of it. That seems to work for me most of the time, and you can do it however you want, but that's just what I prefer. So I'm gonna go ahead and plug in the rest of this stuff, get it all connected. And if you're doing the same on your end, just a reminder to route all the cables through the cutout that's closest to where it's going. That's going to just make things a lot tidier in the end. And here's a quick look at the finished cable management. It all came together pretty nicely. Again, there's just so much room back here. It's pretty forgiving. But I did spend some time just tying things down, trying to line cables up as best as I could. I didn't spend a tremendous amount of time on it, that being said. You can see we've got our fan hub / controller right here that I just placed at the bottom. It's not really tied down to anything, but it's not bouncing around either. I probably could have stuck it in the unused drive cage. That might have been a bit tidier. And yeah, everything else came together nicely. So cable management is done, which means the system is done. Holy moly. Let me turn this thing around. Ugh. All right, there it is. It's looking pretty good. I might actually add a sag bracket for this GPU because it's so freaking huge. It is sagging a little bit. I'll worry about that later. But for now, the last thing you really need to do here is just plug in your power supply to the back and make sure that the switch on the PSU is flipped to the on position, and you're ready for your very first boot. If the power supply's on. I didn't even. Let's try that again. Whoa! I forget how rad these fans look. Pretty epic, actually. And yeah, that's the payoff, folks. Take some time, take some effort to put a PC together, especially a high-end one like this, but man, the end result is always just so worth it. Man, that's beautiful. The build is done. The video is done. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, whether you were watching it for funsies or if you were building a system alongside it. Hope it provided some assistance. But guys, thank you very much for watching this video. As always, toss a like on it if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more of my videos coming really soon. Click the notification bell if you'd like to get notifications on said videos. And thanks again for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.